So here we're going to talk about parent functions in general, and this should be really short and sweet, really actually not even examples. We're just going to go through what a parent function is and the different types of parent functions you need to know for this quiz and the couple that follow. So a parent function is the most basic function that exists within a family of functions. So there are lots of different families of functions that we're going to learn. For right now, we're just focusing on these four families: linear, absolute value, quadratic, and reciprocal. So the most basic means that it's going to be the simplest, which means that its equation is going to have nothing in it except what makes it part of that family. So the linear parent function, the simplest, most basic linear equation or linear function that we can write, is f of x equals x. Remember that linear functions are just to the first power. So just a plain old x is as simple, is as basic as we can get. The absolute value parent function would be f of x equals absolute value of x, because the absolute value is what makes it part of that family. Quadratic is f of x equals x squared. This is the simplest because the squared is what makes it quadratic. And then finally, the reciprocal family of functions, the most basic one we can have here is 1 over x. The reciprocal functions, we have a plain x in the denominator, and so that is the simplest we can get. So it's going to ask you questions about what a parent function is. It's going to ask you to identify, which one is which of these, is a quadratic parent function, so on and so forth. And then it's going to ask you to identify and or describe characteristics of the graphs. So we're going to look at each of these parent graphs and just talk about some of their characteristics. So linear, if we go, I just want to go to y equals, and I type in y equals x, and then graph. I can see what my parent linear function looks like. Obviously, linear, it should be a line, but on the quiz, they're just going to ask you questions about this function. It'll say the linear parent function, and then you have to check all that applies. So they might say has a slope of 1, because it does. Has a y-intercept at 0, is a line. There's lots of things it could say. They might say what quadrants the graph is in. So remember that when we talk about quadrants, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So when we look at our linear parent function, if you're just jotting these down so that you have them, the linear parent function, because it's f of x equals x, it's going to start at 0, 0, because that's its y-intercept, and then it's going to go up 1, right 1, up 1, right 1, or down 1, left 1, down 1, left 1. And again, if we're talking about quadrants, this is quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. So the linear parent function is in quadrants 1 and 3. The absolute value parent function. So linear, obviously the shape is a line. When we're talking about an absolute value, the shape is going to be a V for the parent function. So I'm going to show you both on Desmos and the graphing calculator. On Desmos, you have to use absolute value, I believe, ABS. Not SX. Here we go. So here is y equals absolute value of x. So you can see it also starts at 0, 0. And this part of it, what's in quadrant 1, is the exact same as the linear. It has a slope of 1, up 1, right 1, up 1, right 1. But instead of having a side down here in quadrant 3, it has a similar side in quadrant 2 with a slope of -1. And so it gives us that V shape. On the graphing calculator, if you need to know how to do that in your y equals screen, you would go there, and then the absolute value is in the math menu under the NUM. So math NUM, and then choice 1 gives you the bars. Type your X and graph, and you can see it gives us the same thing. So again, they'll ask you to describe things about it. It starts at the origin. What's the slope of the right side or the left side? What quadrants is it in? But this is what it looks like. The quadratic parent graph, we've already talked some about quadratic graphs in previous sections, and we found, vertex and x-intercepts, things like that. The most basic quadratic is just the y equals x squared. So if I delete this one, and you can either use this little guy at the bottom for the keyboard to get x squared, or you can type it using the caret. So here's the quadratic parent graph. Again, it starts at 0, 0. Most of these have had a point at the origin. That's its vertex. And then we have branches in both quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. We've got 1, 1, and then 2, 4 because it's squared, right? If I plug in 2 for x, I get 4 for y. If I plug in 3 for x, 3 squared is 9. So 3, 9. And then the same thing, -3, 9, -2, 4, so on and so forth. And so our general shape here would look like this. So then I'm trying to switch back and forth so that I'm using both graphing calculator and Desmos, whatever you're comfortable with. So the reciprocal parent function, I did alpha y equals to do this. You can use the divided by key of course, as well. But it's 1 over x, so x is in my denominator. And this graph, so I want to make sure you understand that on these, it's going to look like the graph stops here. It doesn't. It gets infinitely small, so small that the pixelation can't pick it up. But these go on forever and ever and ever and ever. They have arrows on both ends. This shape that the reciprocal function makes is called a hyperbola. So they will use that notation. So this is a hyperbola shape, and we'll draw our general function. This is the only one of these 4 families that we're going to study right now that does not have a point on the origin. It has its branches in quadrant 1 and 3, just like the linear does. Notice I'm putting arrows on both ends because the shape, what happens is as my x gets closer and closer to 0 on both sides, it gets infinitely large or small. And here we just get closer and closer to the y being 0. And so that would be what the shape looks like. So again, on your quiz, really you just need to know what the equations are for each of these parents, what the graph looks like, and be able to describe characteristics of the graphs, shape, slope, where the points are, what quadrants it's in. If you can do all that, you're good to go. Make sure you reach out if you have questions.